In this video, we take a look at filled tubular beaded netting. Stay with me and I'll show you how. Filled tubular netting is more sturdy than regular tubular netting, so it's a great stitch if you want a rope that has the netting style but isn't quite so floppy or airy. So let's get started. For this stitch we will need span beads, accent beads and fill beads. For my span beads I'm using these 10-0 seed beads in gold. For my accent beads I'm using these 8-0 seed beads in green. And for my fill beads I'm using these 4mm check fire polish beads. I threaded my needle with about an arm span of thread. And we begin our first row by picking up a fill bead, an accent bead, a fill bead, an accent bead, a fill bead, and an accent bead. So we have 3 fill beads and 3 accent beads alternating. We slide those down, leaving about a 6-inch tail, and we want to turn these into a circle, so we come back around and we sew through the first 2 beads, coming in through the same end the tail is coming out of. And we want to make sure we're coming out one of the accent beads. Now for our second row we're going to begin our netting, and we want to pick up however many beads will come over our fill bead and to the next accent bead. So I think I might need 3 span beads for this one. So I pick up 3 spans, an accent bead and 3 span beads. We're coming out of this accent bead, we skip over this fill bead and we sew through the next accent bead. And that number of beads fits nicely over the fill bead. If it's too tight, you might want to add an extra bead to either side of the accent bead. If it's too loose, use 1 bead less, just as long as you have the same number of beads on either side of the accent bead. In this case, 3 beads on either side fits nicely, so I'm going to carry on. I pick up 3 span beads, an accent bead, and 3 span beads. I skip over the next fill bead and sew through the next accent bead. Pick up 3 span beads, an accent bead and 3 span beads. We skip over the next fill bead and sew through the next accent bead. Now we've reached the end of the row, we want to step up to start our next round. We sew up through these 3 span beads and the next accent bead. And we're in position to start our next round. The next round is easy. We're going to be sewing through these accent beads that are sticking up. We pick up a fill bead. We're coming out of this sticking up accent bead and we sew through the next one. Pick up a fill bead. We sew through the next sticking up accent bead. Pick up a fill bead. We sew through the next sticking up accent bead. Now we start our next netting row. We pick up 3 span beads, an accent bead and 3 span beads. We skip over the fill bead and we sew through the next accent bead. Pick up 3 span beads, an accent bead and 3 span beads. We skip over the next fill bead and sew through the next accent bead. Pick up 3 span beads, an accent bead and 3 span beads. We skip the next fill bead and we sew through the next accent bead. And we've reached the end of the round, so you want to step up by sewing through the next 3 span beads and the next accent bead. Now we're ready to start our next fill row, and we pick up a fill bead. We're coming out of this sticking up accent bead, and we sew through the next one, and we pick up a fill bead, sew through the next sticking up accent bead, pick up a fill bead, and we sew through the next accent bead. Let's start our next netting row. We pick up 3 span beads, an accent bead, and 3 span beads. We skip over the fill bead, and we sew through the next accent bead. Pick up 3 span beads, an accent bead, and 3 span beads. Skip over the next fill bead and sew through the next accent bead. Pick up 3 span beads, accent bead, 3 span beads. We skip over the fill bead, sew through the next accent bead, and at the end of the round we step up through the next 3 span beads and the next accent bead. Now we're back to our fill row, where we pick up our fill beads and sew through the sticking up accent beads. Then we continue with our netting row by picking up our sets of 3 spans, 1 accent and 3 spans, skipping the fill bead and sewing through the next accent bead. And when we come to the end of the round, we sew through that last accent bead, then step up through the next span beads and the next accent bead. And then we're in position to start our next fill row. Keep going until you reach your desired length. And that's how to do filled tubular beaded netting.